So, welcome to the Accordion Revolution Book Club. My name is Bruce. I am your author here, accordion historian. I wrote this book, Accordion Revolution, People's History of the Accordion, and it follows the accordion in North America, sort of from its development in the 1800s in the Industrial Revolution until about 1960, when rock and roll came and it crushed the accordion. So we're gonna start now with take out our One Less Guitar bookmark. Talking about here, we're gonna start with the dawn of the accordion revolution, and so we're gonna be reading some of that right now. So bookmark. Here's the equivalent chapter. The story of the accordion begins amidst some of the most drastic cultural transformations in history. Colonial empires and industrialization were spreading. Slavery was officially ending. Wars and famines swept through Europe and elsewhere. These and unprecedented intercontinental migration were the backdrop as musicians from all parts of the world stumbled upon this new instrument. Accordions Conquers the World. Chapter 1. The accordion emerged at the height of Europe's Industrial Revolution and quickly traveled across the planet. Everywhere the instrument came ashore, squeeze boxes transformed, trampled, and sometimes totally obliterated existing music. Folk cultures faced a musical virus with no immunity, and the accordion was generally unstoppable. As factories in Europe churned out instruments, they followed the colonizing empires everywhere, from the Arctic poles to Zanzibar off the coast of East Africa. Any place early steamships went, sailors dragged along the cheap, sturdy accordion and its cousin, the smaller concertinas. As the instrument developed and changed over time, the kinds of accordions that gained regional popularity left a chronological map of their arrival in each new culture. They changed names at every border while developing radically different shapes and sounds. Buttons were rearranged or transformed into piano keys as different instruments became associated with each region's styles. I'll break in if you don't get all that. They play all different kinds of accordions all over the world, and if you look at them, a lot of times they sort of arrived in one place, and that's the kind they play there. Other kinds arrived in another place, that's the kind they play there. So it's kind of, you can look around regionally and see which different kinds of accordion they play in your region. There will be a quiz. By the early 20th century, the most famous Irish accordion records were being made by a German-American in New York City. Louisiana's Black Creole accordionists mixed with Cajun fiddlers to create separate but similar musical first cousins. All across the United States, a heady mix of recent European immigrants joined long-time Hispanic residents and native peoples to share stories and music that enriched distinct traditions and created hybrids, often bridged by the ever-mutating polka and other European dance music. Over and over, the accordion entered the musical arena through ethnic styles from various ends of the earth to compete with instruments like fiddles and bagpipes. It secured a place because it could be heard over audiences cheering and dancers stomping feet. It may not have made the world a better place, but the accordion, manifesting the industrial age, certainly made it a noisier one. In North America, accordions eventually reached the height of their popularity in the 1950s. They were promoted as modern and even futuristic. Compared to family pianos, they were portable, relatively cheap, and as stylish as the late chrome-accented automobile. By the 1960s, the instrument's glory days were numbered, but how had they reached their height? The fiddle was the most common instrument before the Civil War and was part of many traditions in the colonies and the New Republic. Horns and brass bands rose after the Civil War. But pianos were the king of home instruments as people began to purchase the first pop songs as sheet music. By the 1920s, mail-order instruments like guitars began to dominate many folk traditions. Things changed, though, and vast numbers of outdated parlor pianos were eventually discarded. And by the 1920s, record players were among the most significant musical instruments in people's homes. Live music began to wilt before the power of the household radio and the cheap jukebox. The home piano market crashed, but they provided cheap instruments to support blues, boogie-woogie, and jazz. Though blues and jazz players largely rejected the accordion, it became incredibly popular in mainstream culture. One result today is that a glut of used accordions from the boom times of the 50s and 60s is fueling the rebirth of the instrument we're seeing today. What happens when the pool of old accordions are used up remains a topic of nervous debate among aficionados. Uncovering the accordion's history is uniquely challenging because for several decades most writers ignored it. Research into folk, blues, and rock music blossomed from the 1960s to the 80s, just as the accordion arrived at its lowest point of cultural cachet. One concrete result was that most historical accordionists died without being investigated. We're missing the accordion's share of the tens of thousands of books that discuss Miles Davis, U2, or John Lennon's intent in I Am the Walrus. Books on genres like Western swing, where a quarter of the bands had accordionists, might name only a few players, or even imply that accordions weren't typical instruments. It's a frustrating challenge to research topics no one has worked on in 50 years, and it's deeply saddening that so much has been lost through neglect. At the same time, uncovering new characters and stories amidst otherwise well-trodden popular music is thrilling. The accordion offers this balance of joy and loss with every new artist and era. The accordion's ancient roots. The earliest relatives of the accordion appeared in Asia's Bronze Age. The most basic Asian free reeds look like precursors to Western jaw harps. These simplest free reeds were made from natural materials like wood, palm, or bamboo, and eventually copper and bronze. When mouth arts like this are played, as they still are today in Southeast Asia, a plucked reed is amplified when air is blown through it. If the reed has close tolerances, blowing through it can sound a note with no plucking necessary. These are the seeds of all later accordions. Resonating chambers of gourd or bamboo were added by early instrument makers, along with fingering holes to adjust the reed's pitch. Finally, reeds were tuned to individual pitches to improve the range and strength of the notes. Multiple reed instruments like the Chinese sheng, said to have been invented 3,000 years ago when the emperor wanted to hear the sound of the mythical phoenix, or the Laotian keng, eventually bore fruit in Europe. Caravans like those described in the tale of Marco Polo carried Asian free reed instruments to Europe, where they began to appear in illustrations during the 1600s. According to researcher Pat Misson, who provided these photos right here, by the 1700s, a Bavarian named Johann Wild was performing on the sheng in St. Petersburg, Russia. At the same time, a French Jesuit returned from China with detailed descriptions about how instruments like the sheng worked. Back in St. Petersburg, in 1780, Christian Gottlob Kratzenstein won a prize for his speaking machine. It was the first known original European free reed, designed to imitate the human voice using unusual semicircular reeds. You can check out the patents online, they're very strange. European wind instruments had already been using bellows to sound pipe organs, bagpipes, and smaller portative organs, and the basic ingredients for the accordion and its relatives were thus present in Europe by the late 1700s. The non-musical ingredients that led to their dramatic success were at the same time quite literally picking up steam. The Industrial Revolution. Aside from a few handmade metal parts, early accordions were made of wood and paper, which had been available to European craftspeople for centuries. Mass production of accordions, however, required new technology to make wire and screws. Most pressing were the need for sheet metal to produce accordion reeds and reed plates. Very early reeds were individually hammered from silver or brass wire. Brass and steel reeds were later cut and tempered in small quantities using processes perfected for watch springs. Without technological advances, accordions would have remained an exotic luxury for the wealthy. In the early 1700s, crude metal sheets were made using flatting mills with water-powered hammers weighing as much as 800 pounds. Precisely gauged sheet metal would require the development of precision rollers. Making rollers, in turn, involved the casting of gigantic lathes. And by 1829, mines, smelters, lathes and rollers and mills were all in place, and on cue, the age of the accordion began. In the 1780s, James Watt's steam engine began powering his partner Matthew Bolden's Birmingham factory and producing brass sheets for making toys. As materials became available, manufacturers began developing new musical instruments, screws, fasteners, metal rods, and what began as toys. Screws, fasteners, metal rods, levers, springs, and the reeds without which the instrument were silent. What began as a toy inspired more advanced cousins that in the next half-century spread throughout the world. Even today, the accordion remains a hybrid of hand craftsmanship and industrial manufacturing. The most expensive handmade accordions use some pre-manufactured parts. At the same time, accordion factories never fully mechanized. Even as models grew more complicated with hundreds of machined components, the factory-made reeds at the heart of the instrument were still fashioned by hand and tuned by ear. The instrument is born. It says so right here. The accordion is one of the few instruments with a verifiable birth certificate, though one with its share of controversy. The first patent for something called an accordion was filed on May 6, 1829, by Cyril Damian and his sons in Vienna, the center of European music at the time. Instruments similar to Damian's with metal reeds, bellows, and keys or buttons had been developed by a number of inventors in the second decade of the 1800s. By 1822, Christian Friedrich Ludwig Buchmann had invented his Handolin hand harmonica for use in tuning organs. It had bellows, but it didn't play groups of notes together. Damian's innovation was to add chords and promote his instrument for use by amateurs. And he came up with the name accordion. Also, in 1829, the British physicist Charles Wheatstone patented his symphonium, which is a handheld metal box with buttons that triggered reeds when blown into. His patent includes a diagram of a bellows-driven version that presaged his English concertina. They didn't get around to patenting that until 1844. The accordion's mouth-blown cousins were progressing at the same time. Wheatstone had seen the German Mundharmonika mouth organ and the simple Eulina, which were the first commercially successful European free-reed instruments. These led directly to what we would recognize as the common pocket harmonica and an array of more elaborate designs. The Eulina gets a picture here. It's these little handheld metal plates, or sometimes they were ivory, and they just had the reeds built right into them. So you would blow right through the reeds. And the harmonica basically put this in a box so you could do it without messing. It was easier anyways. Harmonica. That's a different book. Has anybody written that book? I'd read that. As another aside, in 1829, we also saw an American, William Austin Burt, patented his typewriter, which mechanized writing the way accordions mechanized music. Typewriters and accordions required similarly sophisticated machined parts enabled by the same engineering advances. As with the accordion, in a barrage of innovation, it's estimated the typewriter was invented more than 50 times by different people. They're all kind of jockeying for that spot in the history books. And accordion-related instruments developed quickly in Russia, Austria, Germany, France, England, and later in Italy. There was constant innovation in workshops, turning out a flurry of different designs. Given people's unprecedented mobility, immigrants then took the various concertinas, accordions, bandoneones, and others and spread them around the world. Accordions eventually arrived up and down the eastern coast of the Americas and along trade routes around the African continent towards Asia. By the 1840s, they had reached missions in Canada and minstrel stages in the eastern U.S. The future of music had arrived in North America. Now, last thing in the chapter, we're going to talk about James Bazin, Yankee tinkerer, the first known accordion builder in North America. Yankee tinkerer, inventor, James Bazin. His father immigrated from France, where he'd been a watchmaker. During the rise of free development predating Demien's accordion, the young Bazin began making pitchpipes and harmonicas. In 1824, he developed a horn-shaped mouth organ controlled by a large compass-like dial over a range of 3 chromatic octaves. And that, as the picture here, is this weird-ass thing. Suffering from a cough, in 1827, he added bellows to his unique instrument, and 50 years later, he was still playing his Jules Vernian reed trumpet in his local church choir. After seeing early French and German instruments, by 1835, Bazin was designing and building accordions and selling them around Boston. Unfortunately, none of his innovative instruments were commercially successful or influential going forward, leaving him as little more than a footnote in a much larger story. But totally worth it to check out that reed trumpet thing. That thing's amazing. Next, the accordion family tree. Thanks for joining us for this, the end of the chapter 1 here of Accordion Revolution. If you want, you could subscribe to get future episodes here, I guess. We're going to keep making them as long as the global pandemic keeps us locked in. And maybe eventually someday we'll get a real audiobook of this thing where I pronounce all the names properly. And you can get information at the accordionrevolution.com website for ordering your own copy of the book, or, as I said earlier, the fabulous electronic version of the book, which is lots of fun with all the same pictures and stuff. And it's on sale until April for like $1, so that's a pretty good deal. Jump on that if you want. Then you could follow along and see all the mistakes I'm making as I'm reading, and that will be a good time for everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we could do a theme song, but I think we're just gonna have a jaw harp theme song. I was talking about the jaw harp earlier, and like the bamboo harps that they would make would be kind of like this one, which is just a piece of bamboo that's cut, so it has this wiggly bit here, and you put it on these ones on your lips, and you go. Which then they made, we talked about the brass reeds, and these are, you can see this is a similar thing made of metal, and it's made of a flat piece of metal that then they cut these reeds right into a single sheet of brass. And it would have been done similarly when they made the first accordions. They would have hammered out the metal, probably the individual making it would have maybe hammered out the metal and then cut the reeds with a really sharp knife. And the way these are done is they cut on one side, you can see the cuts are in there, and then they cut it almost all the way through, and they flip it over to this side, and then they sand it with some sort of abrasive just until the lines that they'd cut on the other side, just until they come through. So you get these razor thin tolerances, and you get these cool sounds. And there's a zillion kinds of jar harp that are out there in the world for you to play. I've occasionally mentioned that I feel uncredentialed, and I mentioned this to a friend of mine. He gave me, here it is. Here's my official University of Hard Knocks Doctorate of Life and Rebellion, Department of Accordionology. Bruce Triggs has earned this degree. So there you go. There's my accreditation as an accordion historian. So you can count on everything that's in this video to be accredited. I wrote the proposal for a successful accordion emoji, which should be available on people's phones if, technology continues. It'll be available on people's phones later this year. And in the original proposal, which you can find online, is a list of all the different names of accordions all over the world, that this emoji could unite all those accordions by sort of filling in for all those different names. So I'll just flash that up here, and you can see all the names of the accordions from everywhere. And some of them look like accordion, and some of them look totally different. And the accordion was basically adopted everywhere. So it ended up being sort of owned by everyone. It's an international immigrant.